Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my home office. So you're thinking about a career in academia. How about I go ahead and run down the core career paths that you could be expected to take. You've got a few options and it's helpful to think about what those could be. For starters, almost any career in academia, you're going to need at least a master's and probably a doctorate in whatever field you're going into. This will vary depending on what career you're taking. And to be clear, I'm talking about higher ed, not K-12. K-12, you're going to need a bachelor's and probably a master's, although things are getting interesting in spots and I'm not particularly knowledgeable on the K-12 drama that's taking place. Okay, so you get your bachelor's. Hopefully you got some scholarships, maybe keep the debt down reasonably. Now you're going in and you want to get your master's and or PhD. Sometimes you go and do a master's and then go do a PhD. Other times you just go straight to the PhD, skip the master's. That's what I did. This depends on really what field you're doing, what the norms are for that particular field. For chemistry, it is go straight to PhD. The master's is kind of a consolation prize. Or you can go straight for the master's, but you're planning on stopping and not continuing. Now, I should point out that each time you get a degree, you want to move to a different school. It looks better. We get this idea called academic inbreeding. The idea is if you kept staying at one school, worst case scenario, you got your bachelor's, you got your PhD, and then you started working at the same school, that looks really bad. There are a few schools, particularly the more ancient ones in Europe, where they actually like that, but in the United States, at the very least, that is frowned upon heavily. So get your undergrad, get your bachelor's, and then get your PhD or master's not there. Okay, so at this point, actually I've got some more good news. If you haven't started your graduate degree program, odds are, at least in STEM fields, it should be paid for. You'll probably be hired on as a teaching assistant, maybe a teaching assistant sometime, and a research assistant other times. You're going to be employed by your school. This will pay for your tuition. This will pay a stipend. Sometimes that stipend is actually not bad. Other times that stipend is pretty sad. Now, this is not guaranteed. It does depend on what field you're in. Basically, the school is thinking financially, could we pay a student a small work study? It'll look good for us. It'll help us get grants in if they're doing research. And we don't have to pay them very much. Tuition, we don't really have to pay all of tuition. We're paying it to ourselves. So they're fairly cheap, and so we can have them help teach courses. Or is it, well, we can hire someone with a master's or PhD for peanuts anyhow, so let's just hire them for peanuts instead of hiring a student and make them pay us and not have to pay them anything. If you're not being paid to be a TA or an RA, RA is research assistant, TA is teaching assistant, then that's a bad sign for your future career. That is indicating that in your chosen discipline, there is a fairly large number of individuals with the qualifications and the desire to teach. As such, you're going to be in a very competitive field and one where a lot of schools realize that they don't have to be competitive employers. They can pay you peanuts. Hence, you probably wish to reevaluate your career choices if going to grad school is going to cost you money. Because it can be very expensive in certain disciplines, and once again, that's not a good sign if you're going into academia. Now, if you're going to go into business or something else, the MBA is a different calculation. But if you're going into education, evaluate what's going on. Really do some soul searching. Is this where you want to go? I'm not saying no, but I'm saying really do some soul searching. Okay, so you spent probably 4 or 5 years in undergrad. You spent 4 years. You really should be doing undergrad in 4 years. Then you spent probably 4 or 5 years in graduate school, maybe a little bit longer. Certain disciplines vary, and it is kind of lengthening as time goes by, so maybe 5, 6 years. After which, you've got your degree, you've got your doctorate, you might have your master's, in which case it's going to limit your options, but you still have options to teach with a master's. They are just significantly limited. So you want to get the doctorate if you can. Okay, so you've got your doctorate. Now, depending on what discipline you are and how the job market is looking, this can vary a little bit. So you may be able to just get a permanent position right off the bat. Kind of in the business world, it's common to get a job and every 2-3 years switch jobs. In academia, we're still kind of in the old style where you get your permanent job and you stay there for the next 35, 40 years. You retire and or die there kind of thing. That is changing, but that's kind of the normal motif even still. But quite often you don't get that permanent job right off the bat. So you might be able to, and I've got colleagues who graduated and got the job that they're in, and now they're a full professor and they've worked at exactly one place. But most of the time, you graduate and then it's enough competition that you don't have a competitive enough CV. You don't usually do resumes in academia, you do CVs, curriculum vitas. You need to boost that CV. And so to do that, you're going to get some temporary positions. And this is kind of where you want to start thinking about what is your career track? Do you want to be very research focused with a little bit of teaching? Do you want to be kind of a blend of the two? Or do you want to be very teaching focused? If you're going research focused, what you want to do is a postdoc or a postdoctoral fellowship. These are usually a year or two. You're being hired on by a lab and you're basically being kind of like an under manager. So you've got the principal investigator, the professor, who's running the lab, and then you're working under them and you're running part or all of their lab for them. You're handling budgeting. They're basically subcontracting out some of the work. And, a random professor might have one postdoctoral fellow every now and then. Really big, highfalutin ones, they might have 3 or 4 postdoctoral fellows at the exact same time, maybe more. If they're the ones that pulling down $1 million grants every other year, obviously they got the money. And so this will give you experience running a lab, managing a lab, working on grants beyond what you would have gotten in graduate school. And so this will help set you up for running your own lab. And it looks good on the resume. Alternatively, you could do a visiting assistant professor. So in this case, or a VAP, as the acronym would spell out, you're hired on for 1 to 3 years. It's a full-time job. It usually doesn't pay that great, but it pays okay. And basically, you're filling in for a gap that they have. So it could be that the school, somebody quit, kind of on short notice, and they're like, okay, we need to get somebody in before we have the time to do a formal search for something that's going to be more of a commitment. Let's do a simple search for somebody who we're not really going to commit to. We're just trying to grab somebody. My first 2 jobs were that. My first one, these were both cases where a faculty member moved up to admin kind of temporarily, and so they didn't need to fill a position permanently, they just needed to fill a gap for a couple of years. And my favorite, I interviewed at my first place. It was the weirdest interview. I was like, is this an interview or an orientation? And then when I leave, I asked my boss, I got to ask, did you actually interview anyone else? He's like, no, you had low expectations. You were perfect. Exactly what we wanted. I'm like, thanks. But anyway, so the visiting assistant professor position, you're basically filling a gap that exists. It's a temporary position, so you come in and you know that you're going to last 1, 2, 3, probably not more than 3 years, at which point you're moving on. And you're building a resume. And so you might do a postdoctoral fellow, a visiting assistant professor, 2 of 1, that kind of thing. You're not going to be doing a ton of these. Hopefully by the time you're 5, 6 years out, you got a good enough resume that you're able to get a nice permanent position. Now, this is where I want to bring up adjuncts. The goal of an adjunct professor is to have somebody who is working in the industry, working in the field, and who's coming in and teaching like one course, almost like a hobby that pays them a little money, to share their experience and their wisdom with the students. That's what it's supposed to be. Some fields realize that they could just hire a bunch of adjunct instructors, pay them peanuts, and just run with that. And they don't actually need to hire anyone full-time because these are part-time positions. They don't have to give any benefits. The compensation packages for adjunct instructors is usually terrible. For this reason, I cannot actually recommend you making a career out of being an adjunct instructor. There are people that do this. There are people who are, adjunct professor at 2 or 3 different schools, but odds are that you're not even going to get an office They're really not supported by admin. Your department may be really good and really supportive of you. If you do work with adjunct professors or adjunct instructors, depending on what your school calls them, be nice to them because your school is not. Odds are, at least. So I can't recommend you going that route. That is a way of gaining experience. So there is a scenario where you do that for a few years, you gain experience, and you go for a full-time job. I cannot, because of the compensation packages, I can't actually recommend it. It's a valid approach. Some people have done it and they've had good luck. But once again, you're being paid peanuts, well less than what you deserve. Teaching can be a lot more work than what it looks like on paper, and you're being paid peanuts on paper. So, yeah. Okay, so now it's time to start thinking about permanent positions. And you've got some options. So if you're really wanting to do research, that's your passion. Teaching is kind of, but you want to do the type of research that's done in academia, typically the pure research, the stuff that's not going to go to market within your lifetime kind of thing, or it's not going to go to market within the next couple of years, something where patents aren't going to help you. Well, in that case, you want to go to a large school, something that's going to be able to support a large research lab and that you're going to be able to do a lot of great scientific work with. We typically call these schools R1 schools. R1 is a categorization of how much grant money they're awarded. I don't know off the top of my head how much that is. I'll put it in a description someplace. These are going to have typically a very high research expectation. You're going to be expected to publish papers on a fairly regular basis, potentially annually or more, but you won't be expected to do too much teaching. You might have one class a semester, potentially less. So it's fairly light. Once again, every school is different. Now, if you're thinking, well, I want to do both. I want to teach, but I also want to do research. You know, not so hardcore research, but I definitely want to teach as well. For starters, you might have started that track out with a teaching postdoc. Those things do exist, but they are rare. That's why I didn't mention them earlier. So you're kind of splitting your time. But you're typically going to be looking for a tenure track position at a relatively small school. Not a tiny school, but something that is more modest in size. And in this case, you are going to have the resources to set up a small lab. You may not get graduate students. You may only have undergraduate students, but you can still do good research with undergraduate students. And you're going to be teaching maybe 2 or 3 classes a semester. So you're kind of splitting your time much more evenly. Now, if you're like myself and are like, you know, I did scientific research in graduate school. If I never have to do that again, that would be nice. In that case, you're going to go for the non-tenure track option. This is going to have job description something like lecturer or instructor. Typically lecturer for a PhD, instructor for a master's. So in this case, you're going to be teaching probably 3, 4, 5 classes a semester, potentially a few more. You're not going to have a lab, you're not going to be given resources, but you're not going to be expected to do any research at all. Now, you've got your job. What comes next? Well, if you went tenure track, the general approach is that after about half a dozen years or so, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 5, I've seen as low as 3, that's rare. You're expected to go up for tenure, and this is your first promotion. You're going from assistant professor to associate professor. And so you're going to create a portfolio. Everything you've done, teaching evaluations potentially, your scientific publications, all the stuff you've done, and you're going to go before a committee and basically say, here's my portfolio, please give me tenure. Tenure is going to be a promotion. It's also going to give you some protections from being fired kind of willy-nilly. So it's like, yeah, we don't like you, you're gone. Well, that kind of is the first part. As an assistant professor, that's your probationary period, which lasts for 6 years, I know. You're fairly easy to get rid of. Once you have tenure, you're harder to get rid of. Some schools, you're like really hard. Just don't commit a felony with a student and they can't get rid of you. Other schools, they have to like fill out one extra piece of paper in order to get rid of you. Tenure doesn't mean much. So that does vary as to what that tenure means, but it should come with a pay raise. And typically these positions, if you don't get tenure, it's implied, sorry, we're not going to promote you. In fact, we'd rather you not come back. So if you don't get tenure, you're dusting off the CV and you're searching someplace else. not a good feeling. There can definitely be a lot of drama around tenure. It can be a very stressful time. But once you get that, it's less stressful. Then, after another about half dozen years or so, you have the option of going up for full professor. So it's basically the same thing as tenure all over again, except for there's no, like, if we don't give you the promotion, please leave. We want you to stay. It's hard to get rid of you if you don't want to leave. But full professor, you're going to get noticeably more pay, is basically what you're doing, and more prestige. If you want to move up into admin, this is kind of the path you go. Once you're full professor, then quite often you go into things like department chair and fill in the blank dean, etc. But if you're just interested in being faculty, full professor is kind of the end. You're going to get the most money at this point, and there's no major promotions after that at most schools. Some schools have interesting scenarios. And eventually you retire, and you get Emeritus Status. And Emeritus is basically just retired professor. You're no longer employed at the school. You might get a few benefits, like you can still check out stuff in the library or use the gym or something. But it's basically kind of a token thing. Now, that's if you went tenure track. If you went non-tenure track, this will vary a little bit more. So your lecturer, you'll probably have some annual performance reviews. You are probably going to stay lower ranked than the most junior tenure track folks for your whole career. Although some schools will have kind of a mirroring promotion line, you know, lecturer, senior lecturer. I've heard some schools have a principal lecturer, which is the equivalent of full professor. And those may actually come with protections. You will not get tenure. You will not have, you know, tenure in quotes, you know, but sometimes you may get employment protections, which if you're in a place that has fairly weak tenure protections and you have reasonable benefits from going from lecturer to senior lecturer, you might actually be on par and may as well have tenure. That's kind of where I'm at. So you'll probably get some promotions along the line. This one is kind of evolving more. Lecturers are not the oldest thing. Traditionally, tenure track came first. And so we're starting to sort out what it means to be a lecturer, because this is becoming more and more of a thing. Lecturers typically do get paid less than tenure track faculty. Let's just be blunt, you're not bringing in grants. So, hey, the school is like, how do we get our cut, kind of thing, because the school does take a cut of the grant. And so obviously they're not going to pay you much for that reason, and thus lecturers are more of a budget-friendly option for schools where they can't do swarms of adjuncts, which, once again, that's just, I'm not okay with that. Lecturer is a good, well-paid career, or reasonably well-compensated career. Adjunct, ugh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so that's basically your career path. You've got a couple of choices. Basically, do you want to do tenure track at a big school and be heavy research? Do you want to do tenure track at a relatively modest-sized school and do a blend? Or do you want to go non-tenure track and have basically pure teaching? Additionally, non-tenure track is probably going to have less responsibility for, say, chairing or being a part of committees. I still am a part of committees. My school lets me do that. I like helping out my department, but I'm under no obligation. However, if you're tenure track, you're kind of expected to be on a couple of random committees for what's known as service. So tenure track do actually have more work to do. That's part of the reasons they do get paid more than we non-tenure track, but it will vary. So with that said, hopefully this gives you a few things to think about your future potential career in academia, and have a wonderful day. I'll see you in later videos.